The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel sparkled under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Soft classical music floated through the air as the city's elite gathered for the annual Symphonic Guild charity ball. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled, their laughter mixing with the gentle clink of champagne glasses. Elena Summers stood near the back wall, smoothing down her black and white waitress uniform. At 26, she looked younger than her years, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and warm brown eyes that took in every detail of the lavish scene before her. Her hands, though roughened from years of work, moved with grace as she arranged champagne flutes on her serving tray. "Remember, these people donated thousands for a seat tonight," her supervisor whispered as he passed. "Perfect service, perfect smile." Elena nodded, lifting her tray with practiced ease. She'd been working double shifts at the hotel for 3 years now, but the Symphonic Guild ball was different from the corporate events and wedding receptions she usually served. Tonight the room was filled with the very musicians she admired from afar. As she moved between guests offering champagne, Elena couldn't help but steal glances at the magnificent grand piano positioned center stage. Its polished surface gleamed under the lights, waiting for the evening's performances. Just looking at it made her fingers tingle with longing. "Careful with that tray, dear," an older woman in diamonds cautioned as Elena nearly bumped into her while staring at the piano. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Elena replied, refocusing her attention. In truth, Elena's mind had been elsewhere all evening. 3 years ago, she had held an acceptance letter to the Colburn Conservatory in her hands, her dream of becoming a concert pianist within reach. Then her mother's diagnosis came, and medical bills quickly consumed their modest savings. The acceptance letter was folded away, and Elena took on extra shifts instead of practicing Chopin and Liszt. She still played, of course. Every night after her shift, no matter how tired, she sat at the old upright piano in her tiny apartment and practiced until her fingers ached. The neighbors complained sometimes, but music was the one thing she refused to give up entirely. "Here he comes," whispered another server, nudging Elena. "Victor Renaud." Elena's heart skipped. Victor Renaud was perhaps the most celebrated pianist of his generation. His recordings of Rachmaninoff had gotten her through countless late nights studying music theory by herself. At 45, he had performed in every major concert hall worldwide and was known as much for his brilliant technique as for his rather difficult personality. He entered with an entourage of admirers, his tall figure commanding attention in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. His dark hair was touched with distinguished gray at the temples, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mr. Renaud will be at table 1, the event coordinator told the staff earlier. "He prefers Veuve Clicquot, never Moet." Elena watched as he stopped to shake hands with the symphony director, his expression serious until he broke into a practiced smile for a photographer. She had read every interview he'd ever given. In one, he claimed to practice 8 hours daily, even now at the height of his career. That dedication spoke to her, made her feel connected to his artistry despite their worlds being galaxies apart. "You, waitress." The event coordinator, Mrs. Harrington, beckoned to Elena. "Table 1 needs fresh champagne." Elena's stomach fluttered as she refreshed her tray at the service bar. Serving Victor Renaud felt like stepping into the presence of musical royalty. She straightened her shoulders and carefully made her way toward table 1, where Renaud sat with 5 other guests, all important donors or musicians. As she approached, Victor was in the middle of what seemed to be an impassioned critique. "The problem with music education today," he was saying in his distinct French accent, "is that everyone thinks they can be an artist. True talent is rare, extraordinarily rare." The others nodded appreciatively, hanging on his every word. Elena moved carefully around the table, offering champagne. When she reached Victor, he paused his conversation to look up at her. "Sir, would you like some champagne?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite her admiration. He nodded curtly and turned back to his companions. As Elena leaned forward to place his glass, another server rushed past behind her, jostling her arm. A few drops of champagne splashed onto the sleeve of Victor's immaculate tuxedo. The table fell silent. Elena froze, horror washing over her. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, immediately placing her tray down and pulling a clean napkin from her apron pocket. "Let me help. Is this how they train the staff here?" Victor's voice cut through her apology, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He pulled his arm away from her attempted assistance, looking at the wet spot with distaste. "I apologize, sir. It was an accident," Elena said, her cheeks burning. Victor Renault's eyes narrowed as he examined her. "Perhaps you should consider a profession with less coordination required," he said coldly. "This is a custom Armani. Do you have any idea what that means?" Before she could respond, he continued, addressing his table mates but speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "This is precisely what I was saying about standards. They let anyone serve at these functions now, people who clearly don't belong in these settings." Laughter rippled around the table. One woman in an emerald dress added, "That's why we can't have nice things, Victor." Elena stood rooted to the spot, humiliation washing over her in waves. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her tray. "I believe you're done here." Victor dismissed her with a wave of his hand, turning back to his companions. "As I was saying about the declining standards in musical education." Mrs. Harrington appeared at Elena's side almost instantly, gripping her elbow and steering her away from the table. "What happened?" she hissed once they were out of earshot. "It was an accident," Elena explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone bumped into me." Mrs. Harrington sighed heavily. "Victor Renault is our guest of honor and our biggest donor. Go help in the kitchen for now. I'll sort this out." Elena nodded, fighting back tears as she retreated to the kitchen. The swinging doors closed behind her, muffling the elegant music and conversation. In the bustling kitchen, no one noticed her distress as she leaned against a wall, taking deep breaths. What would her grandmother say if she could see her now? The woman who had first placed Elena's small hands on piano keys and told her music was her gift to the world. The kitchen's noise faded as a memory surfaced. Her grandmother smiling as 10-year-old Elena mastered her first Chopin prelude after weeks of practice. "When you play," her grandmother had said, "you speak a language older than words. Never let anyone silence that voice," and yet here she was, hiding in a kitchen while the man whose recordings she studied nightly had just dismissed her as if she were nothing. After composing herself, Elena returned to her duties, though Mrs. Harrington kept her away from table 1. She worked methodically, her professional smile firmly in place despite the lingering sting of humiliation. As she cleared plates from a nearby table, she overheard snippets of conversation about Victor's upcoming performance. "He's playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 tonight. Just a movement, of course," one woman said. "His interpretation is unparalleled." Elena nearly dropped the plates she was holding. Rachmaninoff's second was her piece, the one she played when the world seemed too heavy, the one she had practiced until her neighbors pounded on the walls at midnight. She knew every note, every emotion it was meant to convey. As the dinner service concluded, the lights dimmed slightly, and the Symphony Guild president approached the microphone at the center of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to welcome you to the highlight of our evening. Please join me in welcoming the incomparable Victor Renault to the piano." Applause erupted as Victor stood and made his way to the stage. Elena paused her work, standing in the shadows to watch. Despite his cruelty, she couldn't deny his talent or miss an opportunity to learn from him. Victor seated himself at the piano with practiced precision, adjusting the bench and taking a moment to center himself. His hands hovered above the keys for a dramatic pause, before descending into the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. Elena closed her eyes briefly, letting the music wash over her. His technique was flawless, each note articulated with crystal clarity, but as she listened more closely, standing forgotten in her corner of the ballroom, she felt something missing in his interpretation. The notes were perfect, the dynamics exactly as written, but the soul of the piece, the yearning and passion Rachmaninoff had poured into the composition, felt somehow academic in Victor's hands. In that moment, a small daring thought entered Elena's mind. She knew this piece differently, felt it differently, if she ever had the chance to play on a stage like this. She shook her head, dismissing the impossible thought. Returning to reality, she picked up her tray and continued working as Victor's performance drew to a close amid thunderous applause. The famous pianist returned to his table, accepting compliments with practiced humility as Elena kept to the edges of the room, invisible once more to the glittering crowd. What she didn't know was that the evening had more in store for her, that sometimes life creates unexpected opportunities in the most unlikely moments. and that her hands, though they had spent years serving others, had not forgotten how to create magic when given the chance. The kitchen of the Fairmont Hotel was a stark contrast to the elegant ballroom. Bright fluorescent lights replaced soft chandelier glow, and the clatter of dishes and shouts of kitchen staff drowned out the refined classical music. Elena stood by the industrial sink, mechanically rinsing champagne flutes as her mind replayed the humiliating encounter with Victor Renaud. "Don't let it get to you," said Tomas, an older server who had worked at the hotel for 15 years. He placed a stack of dessert plates beside her. "These fancy types, they forget we're people too." Elena managed a small smile. "I know. It's just—" She couldn't explain that Victor wasn't just another wealthy guest to her. His recordings had been her teachers when she couldn't afford real ones. She had spent countless evenings with his music, studying his interpretations, feeling connected to his artistry in a way that made his cruelty cut deeper than it should have. "Mrs. Harrington wants you back on the floor for dessert service," Thomas said gently. "Different section, far from table 1. Elena dried her hands and straightened her uniform. "Thanks, Thomas." As she pushed through the swinging doors back into the ballroom, Elena held her head high despite the embarrassment still burning in her chest. The room had transformed during her absence. The main lights were dimmer now, with small candles flickering on each table. On stage, a string quartet played softly as waitstaff began serving chocolate mousse and coffee. Elena worked efficiently, focusing on her assigned tables and deliberately keeping her back to where Victor sat holding court with his admirers. She overheard snippets of conversation about the upcoming auction, rare musical manuscripts, and private lessons with renowned musicians were among the items, raising money for the symphony. Guild's youth program, The Opportunity, to study with Victor Renaud is expected to sell for at least $20,000. One woman told her companion at a table Elena was serving, "My niece would die for that chance, but it's simply outside our budget. $20,000 for lessons with the man who had just publicly humiliated her." The irony wasn't lost on Elena. That sum was roughly what she still owed on her mother's medical bills, the very reason she wore a server's uniform instead of performing on stage herself. At the dessert service concluded, the Symphony Guild president took to the stage again. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we prepare for our auction, please enjoy a special performance. Our very own Maestro Chen will conduct members of the symphony in Vivaldi's Spring." The small orchestra assembled quickly as guests settled in for the performance. Elena found herself stationed near the back of the room, perfect for watching both the musicians and the audience. Despite everything, music still pulled at her, still made her forget herself for a few precious moments. As the familiar notes of Vivaldi filled the room, Elena noticed a slight commotion near the entrance. Mrs. Harrington was speaking urgently with the guild president, both of their faces tense with concern. After a brief exchange, Mrs. Harrington hurried away while the president returned to his seat. Looking troubled, Elena continued her duties, circulating with coffee service but kept an eye on the developing situation. When Mrs. Harrington reappeared, she was practically speedwalking toward the kitchen, intercepting Elena along the way. "There you are," she said in a harsh whisper. "We have a problem. The pianist scheduled for the interlude while they set up the auction has canceled. Food poisoning. The auction items aren't all in place yet, and we need 20 minutes of music to fill the gap." "Can't the orchestra play longer?" Elena asked, surprised that Mrs. Harrington was sharing this problem with her. "They're done after this piece. They have another engagement across town." Mrs. Harrington rubbed her temples. "Victor already performed, and he's made it clear he doesn't do filler music. I'm trying to reach other musicians." But on such short notice, an idea flickered in Elena's mind. Dangerous, terrifying, potentially disastrous. But before she could think better of it, the words escaped her mouth. "I can play." Mrs. Harrington stared at her as if she'd suggested setting the tablecloths on fire. "You?" Elena swallowed hard. "Yes, I study piano. I was accepted to Colburn Conservatory before—" She stopped herself. "I can play." The event coordinator's laugh was immediate and dismissive. "Honey, this isn't a hotel bar. These people paid $500 a plate to hear professional musicians." "Mrs. Harrington," a voice called from across the room. The guild president was gesturing urgently toward the stage, where the orchestra was playing the final measures of Vivaldi's Spring. "I need to find someone," Mrs. Harrington muttered, already turning away from Elena. She really can play, came another voice. Thomas had approached without either of them noticing. I've heard her on the staff room piano during breaks. She's better than good. Mrs. Harrington looked between them, desperation beginning to show in her eyes as applause signaled the orchestra's conclusion. The guild president was now walking toward the microphone, clearly stalling for time. Ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that magnificent? Let's have another round of applause for our wonderful musicians. More dutiful applause as the orchestra members gathered their instruments. How good? Mrs. Harrington asked Thomas sharply. Good enough that I thought she was one of the recordings the first time I heard her. Thomas answered without hesitation. She plays that Russian composer, the one with the big hands. Rachmaninoff, Elena supplied quietly. Mrs. Harrington's expression shifted from dismissal to calculation. What can you play right now from memory? Something appropriate for this crowd? Elena's mind raced through her repertoire. Chopin's nocturnes, several of them. Bach's Goldberg variations, the first 15. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the full piece. Debussy's Enough. Mrs. Harrington cut her off, eyeing the stage where the guild president was now making awkward small talk about the symphony's upcoming season. The Chopin. 10 minutes, no more. You're just buying us time, understood? Not auditioning for Juilliard. Elena nodded, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she wondered if it was visible through her uniform. If you embarrass us, Mrs. Harrington added in a low voice. You're fired. Clear? Clear, Elena whispered. Mrs. Harrington hurried to the stage and whispered something to the guild president, whose eyebrows shot up in surprise before he composed himself. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced smoothly, we have a special treat before our auction begins. Please welcome to the piano, Elena Summers. The applause was polite but confused, especially from those who recognized her as the waitress who had been serving them all evening. Elena moved toward the stage in a dreamlike state, acutely aware of her sensible black work shoes and standard-issue uniform among all the designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. As she approached, the grand piano, the same instrument, Victor Renaud had played less than an hour ago. She heard murmurs ripple through the audience. Isn't that the server girl? What is Harrington thinking? Is this some kind of charity stunt? And then, from table 1, Victor Renaud's distinctive accent. Perhaps she'll spill notes as efficiently as she spills champagne. The comment triggered scattered laughter. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bench. The piano was a Steinway concert grand, far superior to anything she had played since leaving music school. Its pristine ivory keys gleamed under the stage lights, both inviting and intimidating. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. What was she doing? These people had just watched one of the world's premier pianists perform. She was a waitress in a rumpled uniform who practiced on an old upright with a sticky G key. But then she remembered her grandmother's words. When you play, you speak a language older than words. And she remembered the endless nights practicing after double shifts, her fingers moving over piano keys while her body screamed for sleep. She remembered the acceptance letter from Colburn, the validation that her talent was real before life intervened. Elena placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first notes hung in the air like delicate crystal, pure and clear. She hadn't chosen a technically challenging piece to start. This was one of Chopin's more accessible works. But what it lacked in flashy difficulty, it made up for in emotional depth. Under Elena's fingers, the gentle melody sang with a wistfulness that filled the silent ballroom. As she played, her awareness of the audience faded. There was no Victor Renaud, no Mrs. Harrington watching with narrow-eyed suspicion, no wealthy patrons wondering why a server was at the Steinway. There was only the music, the conversation between her soul and Chopin's, carried across centuries through black marks on a page and the muscle memory in her hands. When the final notes of the nocturne faded, Elena opened her eyes, suddenly remembering where she was. To her surprise, the ballroom remained silent. For a terrible moment, she thought they were too shocked by her audacity to even respond. Then the applause began, scattered at first, then growing stronger. She glanced toward Mrs. Harrington, who gave her a small nod, eyes wide with surprise. Elena took it as permission to continue and transitioned smoothly into Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, its darker, more passionate tones filling the space. She didn't dare look toward table 1. Instead, she focused on the keys beneath her fingers, letting the music speak for her in a way words never could. This piece was more technically demanding, with runs that required precision and emotional control to prevent them from sounding merely like exercises. As she played the final chord of the second nocturne, Elena realized something had shifted in the room. The polite confusion had transformed into genuine attention. People who had been checking watches or scrolling on phones beneath tablecloths were now watching her, their expressions thoughtful. Mrs. Harrington appeared at the edge of the stage, giving Elena a signal that her time was up. The auction items were ready. Elena nodded her understanding and prepared to stand. From somewhere in the audience, a voice called out, "One more!" Others joined in, the request spreading through the ballroom. Elena looked questioningly at Mrs. Harrington, who seemed torn between sticking to the schedule and acknowledging the audience's unexpected enthusiasm. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Harrington nodded reluctantly. Elena turned back to the piano. For her final piece, she made a bold choice. The first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the very piece Victor Renaud had played earlier. As her fingers struck the opening chords, she finally allowed herself one glance toward table 1. Victor Renaud was watching her, his expression unreadable, a champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. The first thunderous chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 rolled from Elena's fingers, filling every corner of the ballroom. Unlike the gentle Chopin nocturnes, this piece announced itself with authority, dark, powerful, and demanding attention. Several heads turned in surprise, recognizing the same composition Victor Renaud had played earlier. Elena's version began differently. Where Victor had been precise and technically flawless, Elena brought something raw and personal to the opening measures. Her body swayed slightly as she leaned into the music, eyes closed, letting the familiar notes flow through her like a current. At table 1, Victor Renaud slowly lowered his champagne glass, his attention completely captured. The waitress who had spilled champagne on his sleeve was playing his signature piece, a bold move that could only end in further humiliation or something else entirely. The opening chords gave way to the main theme, and Elena's fingers danced across the keys with surprising agility. This was the music she played alone in her apartment at midnight, the piece that had kept her connected to her dreams during 3 years of double shifts and financial struggle. Every emotion she couldn't express in words poured through her hands. The grief of giving up her scholarship, the exhaustion of working while others pursued their passions, the determination to keep music in her life despite everything. In the audience, conversations had completely stopped. Staff members paused in their duties, trays held motionless as they watched their colleague transformed at the piano. Mrs. Harrington stood at the edge of the stage, her expression shifting from concern to astonishment as Elena navigated the technically demanding passages with surprising skill. The first movement built toward its climax, and Elena's playing grew more confident with each measure. Her technique wasn't perfect. 3 years of practicing on an old upright after exhausting shifts had left gaps in her training, but what she lacked in polish, she made up for in emotional depth. This wasn't the performance of someone playing notes on a page. This was the voice of someone who had lived with the music, who understood its yearning and passion from the inside out. As the movement reached its most challenging section, a rapid sequence of chords that required both precision and power, Elena felt the Steinway responding to her touch in ways her old piano never could. The rich tone supported her interpretation, giving voice to nuances she'd only imagined during her solitary practice sessions. In the middle of the hall, an older woman with silver hair and an emerald necklace dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. Near the back, Thomas watched with a proud smile, arms folded across his chest. Even the kitchen staff had crept out to listen, standing in a small cluster by the service doors. But it was Victor Renaud's reaction that would matter most in the minutes to come. The famous pianist sat completely still, his critical ear catching both the flaws in Elena's technique and the undeniable authenticity in her interpretation. His brow furrowed slightly during a passage where her left hand faltered, but his eyes never left her hands on the keyboard. As Elena approached the final section of the movement, she finally allowed herself to open her eyes, reconnecting with the room around her. The faces looking back at her weren't wearing the dismissive expressions she had feared. Instead, she saw genuine surprise, respect, and in some cases, emotion. She had exceeded their expectations. She had exceeded her own. The final chords resonated through the ballroom, and Elena lifted her hands from the keys, suddenly aware of her racing heart and the slight dampness of perspiration on her forehead. For several seconds, complete silence held the room in suspense. Then, somewhere in the back, someone began to applaud. Others joined immediately, the sound swelling until it filled the ballroom. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause from earlier. This was genuine, enthusiastic, even awestruck. Elena rose from the bench on unsteady legs and gave a small, awkward bow, unused to standing before an audience rather than moving invisibly among them. As she straightened, she finally allowed herself to look directly at table 1. Victor Reno was staring at her, his face an unreadable mask. Then slowly, deliberately, he brought his hands together in measured applause. It wasn't the enthusiastic response of the rest of the room, but coming from him it felt significant. The guild president hurried to the stage, taking Elena's hand as if they were old friends. "Ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that extraordinary? Elena Summers, everyone. Who knew we had such talent right here at the Fairmont?" The applause continued as Elena made her way off the stage, unsure where to go or what to do next. Should she return to serving coffee? Hide in the kitchen? The normal rhythm of her workday had been completely disrupted. Mrs. Harrington intercepted her at the bottom of the stairs. "Well," she said, sounding genuinely perplexed. "That was unexpected." "Thank you for letting me play," Elena replied quietly. "Should I get back to the coffee service now?" Mrs. Harrington shook her head slightly. "No, that won't be necessary. The auction is about to begin." She paused, studying Elena with new eyes. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Before Elena could answer, they were interrupted by an elegant older woman, the one who had been wiping tears during the performance. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Elena directly. "That was quite moving, my dear. Particularly the Rachmaninoff." She extended her hand. "I'm Olivia Winthrop, board director at the Symphony." Elena quickly wiped her palm on her uniform before shaking the woman's hand, acutely aware of the contrast between her waitress attire and Mrs. Winthrop's designer evening gown. "Thank you," Elena said simply. "It's an honor to meet you." "Tell me," Mrs. Winthrop continued, "where did you study? I don't recall seeing you in any of the recent showcases." The question hung awkwardly in the air. Elena glanced at Mrs. Harrington, who was watching the exchange with keen interest. "I was accepted to Colburn Conservatory 3 years ago," Elena finally answered. "But I couldn't attend due to family circumstances." "Colburn? That's quite selective," Mrs. Winthrop raised an eyebrow. "And since then? I've been working here at the hotel. I practice when I can, after shifts." Mrs. Winthrop's eyes widened slightly. "You mean to say that what we just heard was the result of independent study? With no formal training recently?" Elena nodded, unsure if she was being complimented or criticized. "How extraordinary," Mrs. Winthrop murmured. She reached into her evening bag and produced a business card. "I'd like to speak with you further. Would you call my office tomorrow?" Elena accepted the card with slightly trembling fingers. "Yes, of course. Thank you." As Mrs. Winthrop moved away, Elena found herself surrounded by other guests, each wanting to speak with her, ask questions, or simply congratulate her on the performance. The sudden attention was overwhelming after years of being essentially invisible to people of their social standing. Through the crowd, Elena caught glimpses of Victor Reno. He remained at table 1, watching the scene unfold from a distance, his expression thoughtful. Once their eyes met briefly across the room, and Elena thought she saw something shift in his gaze, not quite approval, but perhaps a reassessment. The auction began, and Elena used the opportunity to slip away to the kitchen, needing a moment to collect herself. The familiar clatter of dishes and hiss of steam provided a grounding contrast to the surreal experience she'd just had. "There she is," Thomas exclaimed as she pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen staff erupted in applause, surrounding her with congratulations and questions. "How long have you been able to play like that? Why didn't you ever tell us?" "You made Mrs. Harrington's jaw drop to the floor," Elena laughed, slightly embarrassed by the attention but warmed by their genuine excitement. For the first time in years, she felt seen for who she truly was, not just a waitress but a musician with genuine talent. As the commotion settled, the head chef approached her. "Mrs. Harrington wants you back in the ballroom," he said. "But not for serving. Some of the guests want to speak with you." Elena straightened her uniform, smoothed back her hair, and took a deep breath. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready." She returned to the ballroom where the auction was in full swing. The guild president was enthusiastically driving up bids for a rare manuscript, but Elena noticed that several people were still discussing her performance rather than focusing on the items for sale. Mrs. Harrington waved her over to a small group that included the symphony's conductor and several board members. As Elena approached, she overheard a fragment of their conversation. Raw talent, certainly, but would need considerable refinement. The emotional quality is rare, especially in someone without recent formal training. Reminds me a bit of that Russian pianist who emerged from obscurity in the 90s. They fell silent as she joined them, offering polite smiles that felt different from the way they had looked at her earlier in the evening. "Elena," Mrs. Harrington said formally, "these gentlemen were quite taken with your performance and had some questions for you." As Elena began answering their queries about her musical background, she became aware of someone approaching from behind. The group's expressions changed subtly, and she turned to find Victor Reynaud standing there, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his French accent more pronounced than before. "I wonder if I might have a word with Miss Summers." The group parted immediately, and Elena found herself face to face with the man who had humiliated her just hours ago. The man whose recordings had been her teachers, whose music had inspired her through countless difficult nights, and whose approval still mattered to her despite everything. "Of course," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Victor gestured toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Shall we?" Elena followed Victor Reynaud to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the auction and curious onlookers. Her heart pounded in her chest. Just hours ago, this man had humiliated her in front of everyone. Now, after hearing her play, he wanted to speak with her. She wasn't sure if she should feel vindicated or anxious. Victor gestured to two empty chairs near a potted palm. The auction voice faded into background noise as they sat, an awkward silence hanging between them. Elena smoothed her waitress uniform, suddenly very aware of it again. "You're Rachmaninoff," Victor finally said, his accent thicker than when he was performing for an audience. It was interesting. Elena waited for more, unsure if this was criticism or praise. His face remained unreadable, professional. "Thank you," she said when it became clear he wasn't going to elaborate. "I've studied your recording of it many times." Something flickered in Victor's eyes, surprise perhaps that she was familiar with his work. "And yet your interpretation was nothing like mine." "No," Elena agreed, finding unexpected courage. "It wasn't meant to be." Victor leaned back slightly, studying her with new interest. "Where did you study before this?" He gestured vaguely at her uniform. "I had lessons from age 6 until 18, Elena explained. "My grandmother was my first teacher. Then I worked with Dr. Chen at the community music school. I was accepted to Colburn Conservatory, but—" She stopped, not wanting to share her personal hardships with this man. "But—" Victor pressed. "Life happened," she said simply. "I couldn't go." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. He was silent for a moment, fingers absently tapping a rhythm on the armrest, a pianist's habit. 3 years without formal training and you play like that?" The question seemed directed more at himself than at Elena. "I practice every night," she said. "After my shifts. My neighbors aren't always happy about it." This drew an unexpected small smile from Victor. "Dedication despite obstacles. That is rare." The smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "But your technique has suffered. Your left hand was inconsistent in the middle section. The arpeggios were uneven." Elena felt a flash of defensiveness but pushed it down. He wasn't saying anything she didn't already know. "I'm aware of the flaws," she said. "It's hard to maintain proper technique on an old upright with sticky keys practicing when I'm exhausted." As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted their sharpness. But Victor didn't seem offended. Instead, he nodded slowly. "And yet, despite these limitations, you captured something in the piece that many technically perfect pianists miss completely." Elena looked up, surprised by what sounded almost like a compliment. Victor continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer. "Rachmaninoff wrote this concerto after a period of deep depression. He had been crushed by the criticism of his first symphony. For 3 years he barely composed at all. This piece was his return, his statement that he would not be defeated." I know, Elena said softly. Victor raised an eyebrow. Do you? Or did you read that in a program note somewhere? I've read his letters, Elena replied. And his wife's memoirs. The concerto isn't just about triumph. It's about doubt and fear and finding your way back to something you thought you'd lost. Something shifted in Victor's expression. A hint of genuine surprise, perhaps even respect. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Mrs. Winthrop approaching with a small group of well-dressed patrons. Ah, Victor, I see you've already discovered our hidden treasure, Mrs. Winthrop said warmly. Elena, dear, these friends were simply captivated by your performance and wanted to meet you. Elena rose, feeling strange being introduced as if she were a guest rather than staff. The next few minutes were a blur of handshakes and compliments, questions about her background and training. She answered as best she could, increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. Through it all, Victor remained seated, watching the scene with an inscrutable expression. When the group finally moved away, promising to speak with Elena later, she turned back to find him still studying her intently. You're not used to this, he observed. To what? Being seen. The simple statement struck Elena with unexpected force. He was right. For 3 years she had moved through rooms like this one, invisible to the guests she served. Even in her daily life, she was just another face in the crowd, another person struggling to make ends meet. Tonight was the first time in years anyone had truly seen her as she saw herself, as a musician. No, she admitted. I'm not. Victor stood abruptly. Come with me. Without waiting for her response, he walked toward the stage where the grand piano still waited, gleaming under the lights. The auction had moved to a different section of the ballroom, leaving this area temporarily empty. Elena followed hesitantly, unsure what he intended. When they reached the piano, Victor sat on the bench and patted the space beside him. Show me how you practice the left-hand part of the development section. Elena blinked in surprise but sat beside him. The bench was barely wide enough for both of them, and she was acutely aware of sitting shoulder to shoulder with one of the world's premier pianists. Victor Renaud, whose CDs she had saved up to buy, whose performances she had watched countless times on borrowed library DVDs, was asking to see how she practiced. I usually start by isolating the left-hand pattern, she said, placing her left hand on the keys. She began to play the running passage that had given her trouble earlier, moving through it slowly and deliberately. Victor watched her fingers intently. Stop, he said after a moment. Your wrist is too tense. That's why you're missing the connectivity between these notes. He demonstrated the passage, his hand flowing effortlessly across the keys. You're working too hard. The piano will do more if you let it. For the next several minutes, he guided her through the passage, offering small adjustments to her technique, the angle of her wrist, the rotation of her forearm, the connection from one finger to the next. Elena absorbed every suggestion, making mental notes to incorporate into her practice. Try again, he instructed. Think of the phrase as a single gesture, not individual notes. Elena played the passage once more, applying his suggestions. The difference was immediately noticeable, smoother, more controlled, with greater dynamic range. Better, Victor said with a nod. Much better. Now the right hand. They continued this impromptu lesson, oblivious to the curious glances from guests who wandered past. Victor was a demanding teacher, interrupting frequently to correct or demonstrate, but his criticisms were precise and constructive rather than dismissive. You have developed some unfortunate habits, he told her frankly. But your musical instincts are unusual, genuine. He hesitated as if measuring his next words carefully. Your performance reminded me why I began playing in the first place. Coming from Victor Renaud, this was extraordinary praise. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, a validation she had craved for years without realizing it. Thank you, she said simply. Don't thank me, Victor replied, suddenly brusque again. Just fix that left hand. Their unusual lesson was interrupted by the guild president approaching the stage, looking both confused and impressed to find his guest of honor giving an impromptu piano lesson to a waitress. Victor, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're ready to announce the winner of your masterclass package from the auction. Victor nodded and rose from the bench. We'll continue this another time, he told Elena, his tone making it unclear if this was a genuine promise or merely a polite dismissal. As he walked away, Elena remained at the piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. Had any of this actually happened? Had Victor Renault, who hours ago had humiliated her in front of everyone, just given her a piano lesson on stage at the Symphony Guild ball? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Mrs. Harrington approaching, until the event coordinator cleared her throat loudly. "Elena," she said, her tone uncharacteristically respectful. "There are several people asking to speak with you, including the dean of the music department at City University." Elena looked up in surprise. "The dean? Why would he want to speak with me?" Mrs. Harrington gave her an exasperated look. "Because you just gave the performance of a lifetime in front of the entire arts community, that's why. Now come along and straighten your uniform." As Elena followed Mrs. Harrington back into the crowd, she glanced toward the stage where the guild president was announcing that the private lessons with Victor Renault had sold for $30,000, a record for the annual auction. Victor stood beside him, smiling politely for photos, every inch the celebrated maestro. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room. Victor gave her a nearly imperceptible nod, before turning his attention back to the wealthy patron who had won his lessons. The simple gesture felt like a bridge between their worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart just hours ago. Elena straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly as she prepared to meet the dean. Something had shifted tonight, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't just surviving, but pursuing the passion she had reluctantly set aside. The night wasn't over yet, and she suspected that her conversation with Victor Renault wasn't either. The week following the Symphony Guild charity ball passed in a blur for Elena. By the time she had arrived at her small apartment that night, well past midnight, her phone was filled with voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize. Word had spread quickly through the city's tight-knit musical community about the waitress with unexpected talent. On Monday morning, Elena had barely slept when her phone rang again. It was Mrs. Winthrop from the Symphony Board, asking if Elena could meet her for coffee. By that afternoon, Elena was sitting across from the elegant older woman at a cafe near Symphony Hall, still wearing her uniform from the morning shift she couldn't afford to miss. "My dear," Mrs. Winthrop said after they exchanged pleasantries, "I've spoken with several members of our education committee. We have a special scholarship fund for exceptional cases. We'd like to offer you a place in our Young Artist program." Elena nearly spilled her coffee. The Young Artists program was typically reserved for the most promising music students in the city, providing mentorship and performance opportunities that often led to prestigious conservatory placements. "That's incredibly generous," Elena said, struggling to maintain her composure. "But the program requires a significant time commitment. I work 2 jobs to support myself and help with my mother's medical bills." Mrs. Winthrop nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I anticipated that might be an issue. That's why we're prepared to offer a stipend along with the placement. It wouldn't equal your current income, but it would allow you to reduce your hours and focus more on your music." Elena's hands trembled slightly as the possibility began to take shape in her mind. After 3 years of putting her dreams on hold, a door was opening. Not quite the same door that had closed when her mother fell ill, but a new one. Unexpected and promising. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes." Mrs. Winthrop smiled. "Talent like yours shouldn't be serving champagne, my dear. It should be shared with the world." That evening, Elena called her mother with the news, tears streaming down her face as she explained the opportunity. Her mother, whose health had improved significantly in recent months, cried with her, a mixture of joy and lingering guilt for the sacrifices Elena had made. "You gave up everything for me," her mother said softly. "It's time for you to live your own life again." The following days brought more surprises. The dean of City University's music department offered her a partial scholarship to complete her degree while participating in the Young Artists program. The hotel's management, rather than being upset about her sudden fame, proudly announced they would accommodate her new schedule, turning what could have been an awkward situation into a public relations opportunity. Through it all, Elena kept waiting to hear from Victor Renault. Their strange piano lesson and his enigmatic parting words had left her with a sense of unfinished business. But as the days passed with no contact, she began to wonder if the moment they had shared had meant more to her than to him. 10 days after the charity ball, Elena was preparing for her final full-time shift at the hotel before beginning her reduced schedule. As she changed into her uniform in the staff room, Thomas knocked on the door. "There's someone asking for you in the lobby," he said with a knowing smile. Very French, very impatient, Elena's heart jumped. "Victor Renault?" Thomas nodded. "The very same. And he doesn't look like a man who enjoys waiting." Elena quickly checked her appearance in the mirror. Her hair was pulled back in its usual practical style, her uniform crisp but decidedly unimpressive. There was no time to change or prepare. She found Victor standing near the grand piano in the hotel lobby, examining it with the critical eye of someone who had played the finest instruments in the world. He turned as she approached, his expression as difficult to read as ever. "Ms. Summers," he greeted her formally. "I apologize for not calling ahead. I've been out of the country." "It's fine," Elena replied, suddenly nervous. "I was just about to start my shift." Victor gestured to the piano. "May we?" Elena glanced at the clock. Her shift started in 10 minutes, but she nodded and followed him to the piano. Unlike the magnificent Steinway at the charity ball, this was a smaller instrument used mainly for ambient music during cocktail hours. Still, it was well maintained and far superior to her old upright at home. They sat side by side on the bench, an echo of their impromptu lesson from the previous week. For a moment, neither spoke. "I've been thinking about your playing," Victor finally said. "It has stayed with me, which is unusual." Elena waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "I understand you've received some offers," he continued. "Mrs. Winthrop called me before I left for Vienna." "Yes," Elena confirmed. "The Young Artist Program and a scholarship at City University. I'm starting next month." Victor nodded approvingly. "Good programs. Good people." He paused, fingers tapping lightly on his knee. "But not what you need." Elena looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You need intensive technical training to correct the habits you've developed. You need daily immersion in music, not divided attention between studies and work." His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind but uncompromisingly honest. "Your talent deserves better than a partial commitment." Elena felt a flash of disappointment. After everything, he was still finding her wanting. "I don't have the luxury of full immersion," she said quietly but firmly. "I have responsibilities. Bills to pay." Victor waved his hand dismissively. Yes, I'm aware of your circumstances. That's why I'm here." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the piano. "This is a formal offer for you to study with me privately, with a full scholarship to the conservatory starting next semester." Elena stared at the envelope, unable to process what he was saying. "I don't understand." "It's quite simple," Victor replied. "The wealthy patron who paid $30,000 for lessons with me at the auction has generously agreed to transfer that opportunity to you. His daughter apparently found your story inspiring. Overcoming obstacles, perseverance, all that. And you?" Elena asked, finding her voice. "Do you find my story inspiring?" The question seemed to catch Victor off guard. For a moment, his carefully maintained professional demeanor slipped. "What I find," he said slowly, "is that in 30 years of performing, I have taught hundreds of technically perfect pianists who will never play Rachmaninoff the way you did that night." He looked directly at her, his gaze intense. "I find myself curious about what you might become with proper training." It wasn't flowery praise or false flattery. Coming from Victor Renault, it was perhaps the highest compliment he was capable of giving. An acknowledgement of potential, an investment in possibility. "The offer includes a living stipend," he added, returning to practical matters. "You wouldn't need to continue working here. You could focus entirely on your music." Elena touched the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was the future she had given up hoping for. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do this for me?" Victor was quiet for a long moment. "Because 3 years ago I considered retiring," he finally said. "I had played every major hall, recorded every significant piece in the repertoire. I found myself going through the motions, technically perfect, but empty." His fingers brushed the piano keys lightly. "Your performance reminded me why we make music in the first place. It's not about perfection. It's about communication, about speaking truths that cannot be expressed in words." He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with having revealed so much. "The offer stands for 1 week. My contact information is inside." If you accept, you'll begin lessons immediately." He straightened his jacket and took a step back. "I am not an easy teacher, Miss Summers. I will demand everything you have and then more, but I believe you might have something valuable to say through your music, if you're willing to do the work." With that, he gave her a short nod and walked away, leaving Elena sitting at the piano with the envelope in her hands. 6 months later, Elena stood backstage at Symphony Hall, waiting to make her debut as a featured soloist with the city's orchestra. She wore a simple black gown rather than a waitress uniform, her hair styled elegantly rather than pulled back for practicality. The past months had been the most challenging of her life. Victor had been true to his word. He was a demanding teacher, accepting nothing less than total commitment. There had been days when she questioned her decision, moments when she wondered if she had traded one form of exhaustion for another. But there had also been breakthroughs, moments of pure musical connection that justified every struggle, and tonight was the culmination of that journey. Her first professional performance since that fateful evening, when she had stepped up to the piano in her waitress uniform. From her position in the wings, Elena could see the audience taking their seats. Her mother was in the front row, healthy now after successful treatment, sitting beside Mrs. Winthrop and Thomas, who had taken the night off to attend. Behind them were several of her former co-workers from the hotel, all dressed in their finest for the occasion, and in the conductor's position, reviewing the score one last time, stood Victor Reynaud. Not as a performer tonight, but as a conductor and mentor. As the lights dimmed and the orchestra members took their final positions, Victor looked up and caught her eye. He gave her the same small nod he had given her from across the ballroom months ago, a gesture that now carried the weight of shared effort and mutual respect. When the stage manager signaled it was time, Elena stepped out into the bright lights, her head high, her heart full. As the audience applauded her entrance, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the sacrifices, the humiliation, the unexpected opportunity, and the courage to seize it. She seated herself at the magnificent Steinway, adjusted the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The orchestra waited, Victor raised his baton, and Elena began to play. No longer a waitress who played piano, but a pianist who had once been a waitress, her unique path giving depth and authenticity to every note she shared with the world.